Let's turn in our Bibles this evening to the book of 2 Thessalonians, chapter number 3. 2 Thessalonians 3, we continue on in our series entitled Steadfast in the Present, and we have been noticing a little bit of a larger section of Scripture that we entitled Separation, being defined by God's standards. And in these verses, beginning back in verse 6 and continuing through verse 15, Paul urges believers to be diligent in their labor. And in doing so, he addressed those who were idle and meddling in the business of others. These individuals, Paul says, were living in a disorderly fashion, and it was hindering the work of God in Thessalonica. And they refused to heed the instruction that had been given by Paul. They refused to follow the example that had been established by Paul. And Paul began to address that issue in this passage of Scripture. The solution for those who were individuals who were capable of working yet refusing to do so was quite simple. Let him not eat. It's amazing. A little bit of hunger drives people to do a lot of things, like work. Okay, that's one of those things. God designed it that way. Instead, they are living off of everyone else, and it is very problematic. And Paul was forced to deal with that as an issue. We've already seen Paul commanded them to withdraw themselves from those who choose to walk in a disorderly fashion because of the negative effect that the disorderly and disobedient would have upon them. They needed to withdraw, but they also needed to maintain a proper demeanor, as he will explain in verse number 15. Paul established a pattern in verses 7 through 12 that he insisted on not being a burden to anybody by taking that provision which actually was rightfully his. Instead of doing that, Paul explains we labored very intensely, night and day, in order to avoid being burdensome to them. And then Paul instructed them who were disorderly and busybodies to live in a manner that is quiet, to live in a manner that causes no disturbance, and eat their own bread. Stop living off of the provision of others and instead work diligently. We want to look this evening at a fourth point, and that is this: the plea to persevere. I don't know whether we will accomplish the text that I hope to accomplish tonight. We'll see how that goes. As I plan it on my calendar, it looks great, and as I develop the message, oftentimes the Lord just redirects things. And once again, that has happened here tonight. I would wonder tonight what it would take for you to stop. What does it take for you to stop doing what you are doing? Very familiar passage. We are not nearly as familiar with the context in which this verse comes. In some ways, almost seems to be kind of out of the place, just right there in the middle. And all of a sudden he says here, verse number 13, "But ye, brethren, be not weary in well-doing." Very interesting in light of what we've been talking, the need to separate. The need to instruct these individuals who are disorderly, who are not being productive. And then he returns right back to that same theme of separation in verses 14 and 15. And right in the middle of that, he gives them instruction, be not weary in well-doing. They were brethren. They were saved individuals. They were members of the Christian community. And Paul urged them, do not allow yourselves to become weary. And we're not talking about a level of fatigue. We're talking about an individual who loses his motivation. He is one who loses his enthusiasm. We often describe this individual today as a person who is discouraged. Paul knew that this was a reality that these believers were either presently facing or he feared they would soon be facing. Let me tell you that this was a reality for them just as it is for us today. It was a battle that Paul faced personally, but it is also one that you and I face today. Yet it's one that I find in many churches to not be the subject of a whole lot of conversation. It's a dark side that maybe if we ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist, then we're all supposed to be happy and all of these things, and we're not supposed to be discouraged. And admittedly, we're not, but we've all battled it. We've all faced those times when it comes down to this issue of discouragement. And so how does the Word of God expect for us to handle that? What are some principles that we can apply with that? By the way, depression, in my mind, is a very strong form of discouragement. Okay, and there may be medical causes, there may be spiritual causes. There are lots of issues when it comes to that. Do not be one of those that just simply gets up and says there is never any reason for a person to ever take medication for depression. That is a very foolish statement. There are medical reasons as to why that needs to take place. Okay, so just avoid those kinds of statements. We're going to be dealing more tonight, however, on this matter of discouragement. I want to begin by saying to acknowledge the difficulties of discouragement. Satan is perfectly content when believers misdiagnose the cause of discouragement, when they discard it as maybe being irrelevant, or maybe they blindly close their eyes as though it doesn't exist. How do we misdiagnose it? Well, you've probably heard believers say, well, I'm just going through a time period and eventually I'll get over it. Well, that's not a very good diagnosis of it. Satan's perfectly content to let you think that, however, and he's probably not going to present a whole lot of opposition to that. Others will say, well, the reason I'm discouraged is because everybody else, or because nothing is going right. Everything in life is just going down the tubes. I tried this and it didn't work, so I just quit. They don't see this as a spiritual problem. Things go bad all the time. The issue is not that we're going to avoid discouragement because everything goes right. We avoid discouragement because we gain a biblical perspective on why these things are happening in our lives. But again, there's a misdiagnosis. Then there are those who say, well, I'll just pretend it doesn't exist. I can just stuff it down inside, and some of us are perhaps more wired that direction. I'm one who stuffs things down for a long time, and then eventually a volcano seems to erupt, and everything that has been stuffed down for a long time is now spewing lava out and destroying all sorts of people. I just got to stuff it down further, I guess. I'm teasing, but this is how we look at this thing, and this is how we oftentimes look at discouragement. And we begin to see how everyone else has it all going right. And before long, we're not even talking about the discouragement. It's not a new problem that mankind has only experienced within recent years. It is not something that is limited to spiritually inferior people. If you are discouraged tonight, don't regard yourself as somehow inferior to everybody else. That just makes it worse. A reading of the scripture will actually reveal quite the opposite. David battled discouragement. Job battled discouragement. Paul battled it even to the degree that he wished he would die. We don't think of those men in those lights. But that gives us a picture of the reality of it. It's not something new. It is not something that is related to those who might only regard themselves as spiritually inferior. Why is it then so difficult to acknowledge? Number one, I think because it is oftentimes very subtle. A person may be perfectly fine going through his day, and then something just changes. Have you ever had that? And all of a sudden, nothing's really wrong, but nothing's really right either. I just don't feel the way I felt this morning or yesterday or last year or whenever the case is. I don't know what happened. I mean, you can't go back and necessarily point to something, but it is very subtle. And oftentimes discouragement is just that. Secondly, it is often irrational. It doesn't make sense. And that's therefore one reason we'd really rather not talk about it. A man might say, well, if I'm discouraged, well, people might just think I'm stupid, or that I'm incapable of handling things, that I'm incompetent in some way. It contradicts facts, most of which we know. The person who, for example, sits around and says, nobody loves me, typically there are people who love that person. Can't say there's always somebody who loves that person, but I would generally think the case would be there's somebody who's going to love them. I do know God does, okay? But from a human perspective, we start thinking through these things. Discouragement oftentimes ignores reality. It ignores facts. Discouragement would rather feed on perception, most of which are false, and most of which are self-developed. We create our own monsters in our own minds. And there's no reason to. We have fights with people before we even see them because we're convinced that there's a problem. And then we find out there wasn't a problem. Meanwhile, we spend 30 minutes fuming over something. It's a self-developed problem. We begin to convince ourselves of certain things through false perceptions to the degree that our false perception soon becomes the reality in which we live. I'm not saying that it is reality, but it becomes a reality in which we live. Well, I just can't do anything right. I just can't. And before long, that's exactly where we find ourselves living. The longer that the problem is allowed to continue to develop, the larger the problem becomes because it is constantly fed and nurtured by perceptions that are simply not true. But it's what we allow. This false reality grows to the point that conclusions are wrong because they are tainted by false premises. I don't think they like me. And then we pass them going down the road and they don't wave. I knew it. Nobody loves me, come to think of it. In fact, I'll see if I can wave at maybe the next person, I'll just wave at him and see if maybe he'll love me, and he doesn't either. Yep, see? You're drawing conclusions off of false premises. So if your premise is false, what does that say about your conclusion? It's false as well. You don't come with right conclusions off of false premises. If we wish to avoid discouragement, we cannot then allow our minds to dwell upon false perceptions. Our minds have to be anchored in truth. What are the facts? What do we know? And if we don't know, then stop it. Well, I think this is what they meant. No, stop that. That goes nowhere. Well, this is how I feel. Well, is that even remotely how you should feel? What are the facts? And we get all off onto our feelings and our perceptions. Discouragement is often irrational, and therefore it is oftentimes difficult to analyze. Thirdly, it is often emotional. Its essence pertains to the emotional, not the rational. It's typically based upon feelings. And that is an extremely subjective foundation that is filled with very little certainty. I don't know how many of you felt this morning, but I doubt many of you felt like going to work or going to class. And some of you are looking at me like, oh, I'd love going to work. I've got the job where I've never worked a day in my life. I've yet to find one of those, including the pastorate, to be quite honest with you. Well, you should enjoy it so much that you never work a day in your life. I've worked some days, okay? You have too. We don't always feel like these things, okay? We base a lot, however, on feelings, and that has very little certainty. Feelings often disregard facts. They focus on the feelings. It is based on something that is ever changing. How you feel now is probably not how you'll feel in an hour. But we start basing things on something that is constantly changing. Discouragement, then, is very difficult to analyze because it is based and it dwells on things that are constantly changing. Why do I feel this way? I don't know. Everything's just lousy. Everything. Really? Everything? Yeah. Your salvation is lousy. Well, no, not that. But everything else is. Okay. It's based not on reasoning. It's based on the emotion. Fourth factor that I find it to be challenging to acknowledge is that it is oftentimes ignored. Rather than discussing it in our culture today, in our churches today, people would rather say, well, you know what, we'll close our eyes to this, as pretend it doesn't exist. We just want you to put a smile on at church. And I know I say that sometimes. It's a frightful group to look at, and sometimes you are a frightful group to look at. I hope you're not all discouraged on the same day, but because if you are, I'm asking you to put a fake smile on. But we get into these things, and then we begin to convince ourselves, well, this is a problem that's just eventually going to pass, and until it does, we can just ignore it. A person can attempt to try to ignore a broken relationship by not discussing it and attempting to solve it, but every husband understands that doesn't work too well with his wife. This is not going to work. We can try to pretend that everything's fine, and everyone in the house knows it's not fine. We cannot correct problems, and I think this is a vital principle for us to understand because it expands far beyond what we're talking about. We cannot correct problems by ignoring them. It seems so simple. You cannot correct a problem by ignoring it. That doesn't solve anything. But that is the normal mode of operation for some. Some people just absolutely can't stand conflict whatsoever. And I'm not saying you love conflict, but you got to resolve these things. And however that is, there's not going to be, to try to ignore discouragement as though it doesn't exist, that doesn't solve anything. The problem is how you are choosing to deal with it is not God's way. That's the issue. And that's what has to get addressed. You cannot just continue to ignore it. Now, you may pretend to ignore it as though it doesn't exist. You may also ignore it by silence. It's a difficult topic to talk about. It is one that pertains to emotion, and people will often choose silence. It's irrational, and we know that. It doesn't make sense. And so for me to talk about it just puts me out on a branch that I know is going to get cut off because some objective person is going to tell me what you're feeling doesn't make sense. So I just won't talk about it. It's irrationality causes people to choose silence. The fact that its cause is sometimes unidentifiable. We don't necessarily know why, at least on the surface. We choose silence. The fact of being judged has caused people to choose silence. You can't do that. Not only do you acknowledge the difficulties of discouragement, you also have to prayerfully examine the causes of it. And there are a lot of causes for it, and obviously we're not going to take time to develop an exhaustive list of it, but there are some causes that will help us once we identify it to solve the problem. This first one is just extremely spiritual. Fatigue. You know you don't think right when you're tired? Chuck Swindoll, listening to him years ago. And no, I don't love everything Chuck Swindoll says. But anyway, he said, sometimes the godliest thing I can do, and this was him speaking as a pastor, is to just take a nap. I implement that, okay? I just need a nap. I really don't very often. But fatigue affects us adversely. God designed our bodies to need rest. When we push beyond what God has designed, we find ourselves growing fatigued. When we battle fatigue, our mind is often not functioning in a proper way. Fuses become shorter. False perceptions are fueled by fatigue. Feelings are even worse when we are tired. What is the solution? Rest. All throughout Jesus' life, you find multiple times when he simply got away. He got away from the crowds. Sometimes that rest came in the form of prayer. Okay? And it provided that which he needed. Realize God will never ask you to accomplish more than you are capable of accomplishing within the parameters of time that God's given you. I don't know about you, but I think I need more time. I got way too much to get done. A 30-hour day? Probably, maybe close. Okay, look at the projects at your house that are backed up. Okay, how tall is your grass? What all projects have been broken for a long time that just, whatever. We have to prioritize things, and we've got to realize God's given us these parameters, and he is not going to ask us to accomplish something more than outside of the parameters that he has given us. A second cause of discouragement is that of unanswered prayer. It's hard when you're praying through things and you just don't see the answers. And then you hear a message on prayer and faith and you think, okay, wow, that's great. I'm going to go and I'm going to implement that and I'm going to watch God answer this thing right away. Yeah, I'm going to go and I'm going to pray with fervor because that's what the preacher said. And I'm even going to fast and it's just going to work out great. And nothing changes. That's discouraging. And here I am. I tried to put that into practice, and all I got out of that was more hunger because I am really hungry because I didn't eat. The prayer didn't get answered, and not going to do that again. Jesus stated in Luke 18 and verse 1, he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. Why do you think Jesus added those words, and not to faint? Because he recognized the reality of it, didn't he? Men ought always to pray. He could have stopped there. But he knew our tendency would be to lose heart, would be to grow discouraged when we don't see prayer answered. The parable that he taught was centered around a widow and an unjust judge. Because of her persistence, this unjust judge finally granted her request. He did not do so with a good motive, lest she weary me. I'm getting very tired of her coming to me constantly, so I'm just going to give her what she wants. God does not respond that way. But here's the statement in verse 7. Shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? Isn't God going to answer this prayer? Sometimes it's going to take time. Now, sometimes that answer might be no. And that's a challenging prayer to accept. But we persevere in prayer. Matthew chapter 7, ask and it shall be given you. Constantly, continuously ask. Continuously seek and ye shall find. Continuously knock and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Unanswered prayer sometimes is a cause for discouragement. Some of you have prayed for years and years and years for family members who are unsaved, or family members who just have not gotten their life right with the Lord. Let me encourage you, keep praying. Don't give up. There were people who prayed for you for years and years and years. And you are here today thankful that they kept praying. You persevere. Don't give up. Man, it's hard. It's hard when you think that you're going to get a favorable report from the doctor and you pray that way and then you don't get the report you had hoped for. It's unanswered prayer sometimes. And this is a hard reality, and it's one we face constantly. A third reason for discouragement is unending struggle. Paul oftentimes encountered hardship. Some of it seemed relentless. David experienced an unending struggle from Saul. Listen to what David said in Psalm chapter 13. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? David saw no end. It's hard to go through struggles. It's easier when you see an end. But when you do not see an end, it's very difficult, and it's often very discouraging. You've heard the phrase, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and you hope it's not a train, okay? Because your tunnel is about to end at that point in time. Unending struggle, chronic pain, cancer. The lists can go on and on and on. Things just don't work the way I want them to work. And there's no end in sight. It gets discouraging. And there are days where you may handle it quite well, and then there are other days. And the focus is not what it should be. Unrewarded labor is a fourth cause. I know people say, I don't care whether anybody even recognizes anything I do. That's probably not true. It's nice to hear a thank you at least every now and again, right? Okay, and I think most people in here will acknowledge that. And some, I don't care whether I ever hear one. Well, you're more of a man maybe than I am. But it's nice to hear that something you did was appreciated. If what you feel is that everything you do is wrong, well, that's not all that grand, okay? And that grows very discouraging. When your labor is, and I'm going to use a word, perceived to be unrewarded, discouragement is quick to set in. Whether or not that labor is rewarded is going to depend upon your motive. We could study Matthew chapter 6 to establish that. If you do things with the wrong motive, then you will get whatever praise you get from man. And that's it. The implication is in Matthew chapter 6. But I want you to notice what Paul stated in 1 Corinthians 15, the chapter often described as the resurrection chapter. Verse 58, therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. The things that you do for God are not in vain. Man may not recognize it, man may not appreciate it, but what you do for God is never in vain. We do well to be reminded of this truth, because there are many times when our labor seems unrewarded. We do all of this around the house and don't get a thank you. Don't get even it being observed. Probably this has happened in many homes where the wife has spent a great deal of time doing something and she just knows her husband is going to be tickled pink when he sees it. And that's probably true, but the problem is he never sees it. And she drops hints and tries to direct the attention, and finally it's like, did you not see it? And then the husband's like, what do I say? What do I say? What do I say? Because if I say no, that's the truth, and I'm going to die if I say that. If I say yes, then I'm lying. Or then if I say yes and she asks me, what was it? Then I'm really in trouble because I lied and didn't see it. Yeah, those battles go on in some husbands' minds. Never has gone on in mine. I'm just saying, oh, yeah, of course I saw it. Well, what's it? Okay. And by that point in time, whatever was done, yeah, it just doesn't matter a whole lot anymore. You didn't notice it for whatever reason. And it's just not a good thing. Unrewarded labor. Fifth cause of discouragement is incorrect perspectives. And I could go on and on and on with a list of things here. Sometimes we conclude our service as unappreciated, I'm unloved, I'm unnoticed, I'm the only one serving the Lord. The lists go on. These are false perspectives. And they disregard facts. I know God loves me. So what am I saying when I'm sitting around pouting that nobody loves me? Okay? It's an incorrect perspective. Why are you even there in your own mind? Oh, it's just me serving the Lord, said Elijah, says many Christians. No, it's not. Don't give yourself that much credit. You're probably not serving him as faithfully as you think you are. Okay, so if I can make you even more discouraged, you're welcome. It's just me serving the Lord. My pastor said I'm not even doing well with that. Okay, it's not that. We know better than that, but we get stuck there in our own minds. And there's another thing that wouldn't be a source of discouragement, but it is listed here. Be not weary in well-doing. Sometimes we get discouraged in doing right, doing what's good. The tense of everything would suggest, be not weary while doing right. Well, why would we lose heart in doing what's right? Well, maybe what we just described, the Elijah syndrome that says, I'm the only one who's doing right. We'll find ourselves very quickly discouraged from that. It may be when doing right seems unrewarded. What's the use? I worked a hard day at work, and the guy who's as lazy as all get out, he's the one that got the promotion. So what's the conclusion? I just won't work hard. No. Okay? Doing right sometimes seems to go unrewarded. We grow discouraged when doing right seems to be punished, while doing wrong seems to be unpunished. Psalm 73, we don't have time to go there, but David acknowledged in this passage a struggle that he had because it seemed as though the wicked were prospering. And he said, Lord, I look at the ungodly who prosper in the world. And here I am serving you, and I'm experiencing all of these problems. And Psalm 73 is David's personal account of this. And then all of a sudden he says, then I saw their end. I saw how things were going to end with them. And I can tell you, as a saved person, no matter how bad I have it here, the unsaved have it much worse. But sometimes it seems as though doing wrong is unpunished and doing right is actually punished. So we acknowledge the difficulties of discouragement. We prayerfully examine the causes of discouragement. And thirdly, we confidently persevere. What do you want to do when you're discouraged? Give up and quit. Don't do so. Here was what Paul stated in Galatians chapter 6 and verse number 9. Let us not be weary in well-doing. Sounds quite familiar, does it not? For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Persevere. Well, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to love the unlovable person, isn't it? But you do it anyway, because it's what's right. It's hard to pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you, but you do it anyway, because that's what's right. It's hard to persevere in prayer when it just doesn't seem like there are any answers to prayer. You might need to examine your relationship with the Lord and see. That could be part of it. But you persevere. You don't just simply give up and quit in the essence of all of this. And then Paul returns right back to this focus of the aspects of the separation, and I'm not going to take the time to return to this. If any man obey not our word, he says by this epistle, note that man, and have no company with him. And count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. We'll talk more about what that passage means in services to come. It may be that you're discouraged today, and things haven't gone the way you wanted them to go. I want you to go back and don't just ignore the reality of it. Acknowledge it. You cannot solve a problem you choose to ignore. Acknowledge it and then prayerfully examine the causes of it. God, why did I respond this way to this circumstance? Lord, that's not how I'm to respond there. That is not what your word instructs. Why is my mind going there? And work through it. And don't quit. Persevere. Satan would love for you to quit. You persevere and watch the Lord work in the long run.